Hello, and welcome to Doctor Who 50 Years Ago, the show that looks back to the stories that aired in 1973 and looks at the differences between then and now. I'm Ben.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Nick.
And whilst people were watching Frontier in Space, the news in February and March of 1973 might have provoked them into certain things. Firstly, a record number of women stood in the Republic of Ireland general election, which amounted to 5% of all candidates. Women from the Irish Housewives Association banded together, with sentiments such as how they are at, quote, the end of their patience trying to budget, unquote, in the face of horrific inflation, because it's all over the world. They add that minor details such as who won the most sports medals was of total irrelevance to them, which is referring to Taoiseach Jack Lynch's sporting medals in his past life. Civilian unrest here is pushing social change, as is the general feeling that the current elite in power in Ireland aren't doing the people justice. Ireland got a coalition government of two different parties after 16 years of one-party power in that general election. There you are, it's miserable economics in 1973, and as we're recording in 2022, we're facing a cold, harsh winter, which is not helped by an economic crisis caused by a European war and after a pandemic.
I think what's interesting about the amount of women coming together is, as you said, civil unrest pushing social change. When there is a massive divide in society, we see it time and time again that is when the ruling parties will have disruption from people who are being disrupted, you know? And so when these Irish housewives come together and they start saying some fairly grounded complaints, that is obviously going to start pushing people away from the current ruling elite. However, the fact that it got a split vote is interesting. They weren't able to completely oust the current ruling party. They were simply able to do a slight disruption. And I wonder how much that coalition government was actually that effective, because you're not able to get as many of your ideas through in a coalition.
I think what this sort of news story shows is as well that if people can't make ends meet, people who would normally be politically not interested, apathetic, that's the word I was searching for, people who would be politically apathetic, a cost of living crisis is the perfect thing to radicalise people, even the most unsuspecting people, say housewives back then. You wouldn't think necessarily would take an interest in politics, but now if you can't make money, now if you can't make your ends meet, well, that'll interest you in perhaps you can run the country better than the current elite because they've run it into the ground.
Another example I'm going to pluck out of the air is bodily autonomy. 1972, I think, saw Roe versus Wade in America sort of decriminalising abortion. And then I'm going to yeek it fast forward to 50 years later when the Supreme Court decides, actually, nah.
One film that we see around this time, in 1971, is Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. And in that film, everything's sort of decayed and dystopian, and we see that the youth are starting to get more and more violent. And this... the divide in social class in that film is driving the government to do ever more barbaric things in order to crack down on the lower classes. And so it's interesting that that sentiment is reflected in what's happening here. Civil unrest pushing social change. In A Clockwork Orange, the government fights back. In real life, as it were, social change managed to eventually keep going. We do see more women standing throughout the 70s and 80s.
Political enchantment and disenchantment ebbs and flows like the tides controlled by the moon on which a penal colony resides. The political socio-economic situation is not great in Britain either. A hugely contentious policy to tackle inflation comes into force, which puts a limit on the amount of pay rises workers can have. The government in 2022 is arguing about the impact of public sector pay rises, saying it will mean inflation will get baked into the economy. The policies in the 1970s are proven incredibly unpopular and, of course, lead to large amounts of strikes that define the decade somewhat. Lack of energy too in 1972 and 2022, strikes causing supply shortages, disrupting companies and schools, a portent of things to come in Britain, with December 1973's three-day week brought in to preserve fuel and prevent the economy crashing. The circumstances between 2023 and 1973 are not identical, and government policy in other areas affects pretty much everything else, but it's still notable that they're clamping down strongly. And also during this, on February the 27th, the first nationwide strike of civil servants in the history of the UK took place for 24 hours, which is about 280,000 employees, which included customs officials, which I've put in brackets. Hi, Carnival of Monsters!
Yeah, it's kind of ironic after spending the last 12 years in power saying the opposition will take us back to the 1970s, that the current government in power has literally took us back to the 1970s.
An early 1970s, before the European Economic Community, in fact.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, the parallels are quite striking when you lay it out as you've just done, Ben.
Yeah. And again, as we previously mentioned in the further article, America goes back 50 years in terms of bodily autonomy and politics surrounding that as well. Ultimately, these are the things we point out with some chagrin and deep horror here on Doctor Who 50 years ago.
What's interesting in Carnival of Monsters is that the workers at the beginning, you see one of them run off and he gets shot down. We're not seeing the working class being portrayed in a... they're not being portrayed as lazy. They're not being portrayed as negligent or stupid about the world they live in. They're being portrayed as oppressed. And if we look at the portrayal of the Time Lords in The Three Doctors, they're not portrayed as the people who know everything that should be going on and are, the brilliant arbiters of truth. They're portrayed as a bit hapless and stupid. It's interesting that nowadays the government is saying, oh, if this group goes on strike, they'll lose the public support. If these people do this, they'll lose the public support. What we're seeing in 1973 and 1972, when these, strikes will start to define the decade, as you said, but we're not seeing the workers being portrayed as negligent scum. And I think that's a very interesting thing, because it sort of disproves the current government's point of, if people keep going on strike, they'll lose the public support. It's not what we see historically.
Although I'd argue, and this is a very minor argument, that in culture it can be somewhat pastiched. And I'm thinking, for example, the Straubs is single part of the union, which comes to define the decade also. I always get my way if I strike for higher pay, is one of the lyrics I'm thinking of.
Well, that is interesting. I guess there are people who are going to be sneering at the strikers. I remember it was a thing in Come Fly With Me. There were jabs at striking workers as well. So people are annoyed by disruption, but I wonder how much a lot of people are going to be annoyed at the institutional class divide.
And how much of it was baked by later political developments, such as Thatcherism and neoliberalism, which is where I'm thinking those comments came from. Come Fly With Me, which is something I wasn't expecting to talk about on this podcast, to say the least, but we have twice. So there. We shall fly back to America. And sorry, folks, the news is a bit British and Anglo-centric, but history is written by the winners and all that. In March, 3 things around President Nixon happen. There's an expansion on executive privilege, making the US presidents and staff immune from having to testify or answer questions about White House events while in office, which applies to former staff members as well. 3 days later, Nixon commented that he would not allow the FBI to turn over its files to a congressional special committee on a hotel break-in during the election the previous year. And then he goes and does something stupid like have a private conversation in a room he bugged, suggesting he's obstructing justice around said break-in by getting his staff to pay money to the burglars in return for their silence. A Doctor Who story with political intrigue in it is transmitted when the political intrigue of America in the second half of the 20th century is about to go a bit wild over a hotel called the Watergate.
What I like about this in Frontier in Space is that the President of Earth and the Emperor of the Draconians, they're portrayed, I think I'm right in saying, fairly nicely. That they seem willing to listen to people, and even though they're not really on board, they're still the ones vaguely on the side of the Doctor and Joe. They're trying to get to the truth, and they're standing up to General Williams and the Draconian Prince, who just want to say, "Oh, let's mow him down."
There's certainly an aspect of primus inter pares, first among equals, with those two roles, in that they're only so good as the people around them, and if the people around them are clamouring for war or being less than intelligent, then that's going to bring the Earth president down, and as we see, leads to opposition leaders. I'm thinking of the Colonel Sanders type figure in episode 6, clamouring for war.
It's interesting as well, the Earth president, as you say, she's depicted as being broadly quite good in this. That he makes reference to General Williams to the legislature. I think do they call it the Congress? Did he call it the Congress? Saying that they would stop the president, or they would force the president to go to war even if she didn't want to. So politicians as a whole, they're sort of being depicted negatively, aren't they? The general, like your MPs or your Congress members, are they're quite happy to go to war or whatever, but the president herself is depicted well, and it shows that the president is fairly weak, which is interesting. Right? Probably post Watergate, you might the serial might have flipped the roles and switched it from the president to being too strong and evil, and then the Congress being the good guys.
In other news, a warning is issued in a report out of the University of Sussex about computer fetishism. It says that while computer models can be used to examine the world, they cannot be endowed with a validity and power it doesn't possess, and that what comes out is only going to be as good as what goes into it. Think about the thousands of times that various doctors in Doctor Who have called computers dumb, unfeeling machines, and you get the picture. And also my favourite four-part Hartnell story, The War Machines. In other news again, an odd tribunal is thrown out of court because the claims were lodged too late. The accused is called one of, quote, the randiest men in town, unquote, and is said to have had 11 secretaries in 2 years, although he denies the allegations, saying he's married and that one of the secretaries was with him for 6 or 7 years.
I guess it's just a little interesting that the judge, I presume must be the judge, quote there, of randiest men in town, just sort of laughing and laughing, oh, he just gets on with those things, doesn't he? He's such a laugh. That's sort of how I read it, the tone of it. So I guess we've sort of come along some distance then in terms of gender politics, I suppose, gender equality.
Well, no. We don't know that that's what the judge was saying. The judge threw it out on a technicality because the claims were there was like a statute of limitations or whatever the equivalent is in civil suits. What's interesting is the man who had the complaints against him says that he didn't want it thrown out on a technicality. He wanted the ability to actually defend himself publicly. So he wanted to try and make sure that this title of the randiest men in town didn't actually follow him around. So what's interesting is also that it's moderate. You could argue some sexism there, but he doesn't want a sexist label attributed to him. So therefore it's not a laughing matter to him. He takes the allegation very seriously, according to the Times coverage.
Finally, a group of flat dwellers in London point out that rents could go up even higher and that the government's policies to mitigate it won't be enough. The Member of Parliament says that the nature of the people of London is changing and becoming transient, with people living in flats paid for by their firms and a, quote, social vacuum in which people eat and sleep, but in which people do not feel they have any roots, unquote, is taking hold. A bit more societal change for you to discuss there.
Well, that quote, again, people from 50 years ago being very prescient, and a trend that's only got more noticeable, I'd say. This whole people, as I said, not feeling like they have any roots to where they live. That's very prevalent now, isn't it? The sense of community has really eroded away in the last 50 years. Yeah, it's interesting to see a quote there where they thought, oh, this is some phenomenon. That was a big deal then, and it's like, it's only got worse. So it's interesting that people can identify the issues but can't seem to do anything about it.
Well, that's very frontier in space, isn't it? The Doctor knows what's going on from the start, but isn't able to get through to power.
And that was the news. And now we shall get into the themes of Frontier in Space, which we've referred to quite a few times in the news. The first one being about future politics. I took down many quotes from episode 1 because there's loads of them, thanks Malcolm Hulk. Firstly, the quote that government's busy passing memos at each other. Also, we see future news reports of the Arctic areas are open, the family allowance is increased for those who want new homes in basically less than habitable areas, which depicts another slightly dystopian Earth of overpopulation and enticements for living in places like the Arctic.
Well, I think that could be sort of interpreted either way, couldn't it? It's a bit difficult to tell whether or not that could potentially be considered, as you say, a bit dystopian, or it could be considered all social progress is being made as though, like, the government wants people to go out and live on the Arctic, so they're giving incentives to go do that, and it's sort of quite a futuristic idea to go, especially back then, to go live up in like the North Pole. So I don't necessarily think it's a dystopian idea. I suppose with now the 50 years that's gone by, it looks a lot more grim sounding, doesn't it? Because of our knowledge of climate change, which at that time was relatively primitive compared to now. I mean, I'm aware that in a couple of series time, we're going to talk about a lot of environmental stuff. But even then, that seems to come more from an angle of pollution as opposed to climate change.
Well, the actual quote is, family allowance increased for those who want new homes in less than habitable areas. I mean, to an extent, it's interesting that they're offering these incentives, but it's what's interesting is that they've taken away a right, and their incentive is just giving back the right that we took away but not entirely. The family allowance is increased. You may now have 2 children as opposed to 1, which we said earlier. So that's kind of an interesting jab at big empires. We're going to take your rights away, and then we're going to give them back to you sometimes if you're good.
I guess the most significant thing, if we're going to talk about the future politics being shown here, is that it's obviously the president of Earth is a woman, and it's addressed as Madam President. What do we think how that shows, what that message that's trying to portray to the audience?
What's interesting about that to me is that Malcolm Holt made a point of making sure that she wasn't the first female president of Earth. And that comes up in every behind-the-scenes thing that you read. He was told, make sure that the president is a woman. And he said, okay, that's fine, but I'm not going to make it too big a thing. And if we look back in 1965, was that when the Daleks Master Plan came out? Which is...
yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, that's the other big Doctor Who serial, however many parts that is, 12 parts. In that, Sarah Kingdom is portrayed as, oh my god, it's a lady soldier. And just before she's introduced, we have all of this, Kingdom will know what that is. When Kingdom gets here, they don't say like her or Sarah or Miss Kingdom or whatever.
Yeah,
there's a big...
It's very specifically, it's very specifically degenderized for the reveal, which is, I presume, a nation exploit.
Yes. So what's good about this is that there is a drive to make it normal. It's not supposed to be a big thing. There's not like a big orchestra sting when we first pan over to the female president of Earth. Malcolm Holt was like, yeah, I'll make her a woman, but it's going to be normal, okay? It's not going to be a thing. And that is a bit of a feminist victory.
And not only that, I believe the actor or actress in question is Polish.
Well, she doesn't seem Polish, so that's... Maybe behind the scenes that mattered, but it doesn't come across on screen. She still does receive pronunciation.
Yeah.
I think just one little note to say that where I think it shows its age a bit to a modern viewer anyway, is the President of Earth is still, she's as a woman, they show her having was she getting like a hairdresser or something like that when the Doctor and Jo get kidnapped by the or the base there and gets assaulted by the Ogrons, and it's a bit like, oh well, I mean, yes, she's a woman, but that doesn't necessarily mean she's going to be having like a manicure, pedicure, and a hairdresser while in her office at work. But there we are.
Interesting.
Indeed, it's more portrayed as stress relief at that point, because we keep talking about the tensions of war and diplomatic relations.
It's interesting because I read that bit as a class struggle where when she's being told these big things, I thought she was having like a massage. It's like someone's massaging her head and her hands.
Okay.
So I wasn't reading it as she's a girl thing. I read it as pass me another grape, Jeeves. What's going else on in the world? There's funny little people who've got themselves in trouble again. Ha!
Okay, it's interesting. It just, to me, it seems a lot, because she's surrounded by women as well. No, it just seems looked more feminine than it would be if they'd done it with a man. If a man had been the president of Earth
I absolutely agree. I think it is perhaps a problem of my 2023 vision of the story. Perhaps somebody at the time would have read it in a more gendered way. We also see that You know, there aren't many female characters in this story, and most of the male characters are warmongers, which is a very obvious gendered split.
Indeed, basically, anytime they go off Earth, it's just Joe.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, like, assume the genders of the Ogrons, but I think they are generally portrayed as just men.
Certainly, any of the ones that speak aren't played by men. They speak
Yeah,
with a male voice.
yeah.
I'm sure Big Finish have dealt with this in their own inimitable fashion.
One element that does suggest a more positive, maybe perhaps societal development is there's there's a black man who is the newsreader, and it's totally unremarked upon. It's in the background. It's not a big deal. No one makes a big deal out of it. And this was from a time period when, as I say, your newsreader on like the 6 o'clock news or something, that was a very trusted person. So to show that society had progressed to a point where people were quite willing to have someone from an ethnic minority or background or from a black background to be that trusted individual reading the news, and it's not remarked upon, it does show progress is being made, and it's good that, as again Malcolm Holt, much like with the President of Earth, he doesn't want to make it a big deal that he's showing that the future Earth has made social progress, because you wouldn't remark upon it in 500 years' time. You'd like to think that whatever, all the petty squabbles that we have going on now will be well above that by then.
I think it's interesting that, I mean, I know this is Malcolm Hulk, who is, you know, essentially just Karl Marx reincarnated, but at the same time, he does see that trajectory. This portrays the future very, very positively. So it's interesting that its message about the future is not only will we have multiculturalism in the future, we will all be happy that there will be multiculturalism in the future. We won't even remark upon it. That is the same message put out by Star Trek in the 60s. So that is an interesting little counterpoint. Once we get to the 1977 Star Wars film, we see people of all races going around. And it's not... I would say that in that film, you don't really have, like, very obvious racism. Like, you have all these various creatures coming together, and they're just sort of there. I mean, I guess you could say, like, Chewbacca is, like, strong, but, like, you know, he doesn't really get slurred, except by Princess Leia when she calls him a walking carpet, which I guess is, like, horribly, horribly racist if you don't take it as a funny joke.
Yeah, the only other example I'd care to mention is the droids being refused to be served in the cantina.
Yeah,
we don't serve their kind here.
Yeah, apparently that was put in because George Lucas wanted some weird form of racism or something like that. And you know, it's interesting that you put it against
doesn't feel
droids.
much like a comment. It doesn't feel like a commentary though, that because as you say it was put into such an article, it doesn't feel like a commentary on, you know, the signs you'd often used to have back then, wasn't it, saying like no colours sort of thing. Like,
And besides, that was all a very long time ago in a galaxy far away.
But interestingly, that you bring up about how Malcolm Holt is showing that it's going to be a nice, happy, fluffy, utopian future, because then you've also got the Special Security Act, where everyone gets shipped off to the lunar penal colony, which I thought was actually a very scarily prescient way of thinking about Guantanamo Bay. This is 30 years before Guantanamo Bay, and yet it's actually got Guantanamo Bay right on the screen there, just on the moon.
And we're kind of supposed to... Go on.
Or if you want to be equally grim, the satellite pictures of very open, very out there concentration camps, I'm thinking in the western provinces of China, the Uyghur Muslims.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention the lunar penal colony, because it kind of supposed to laugh at the old man who says that the basis of his barter is that once the peace party takes over, then you'll receive a full pardon. And it's like, well, obviously you're not going to. You're deluded, old man. You don't know what you're talking about. And like, is that Malcolm Hulke sneering at dumb revolutionaries who don't know what they're talking about? I mean,
I think it is. I think Malcolm Hulke is depicting quite a plausible. I mean, obviously, it looks a bit wonky to present day now with your 50 years on sort of thing. But if you try and think about it conceptually, the future it's depicting, albeit maybe not the fashion sense, I think it's quite a plausible future in terms of how the society is supposed to function. And much as essentially it's a commentary on, I guess, the size society existed then and where Malcolm thought it was going is we've got Guantanamo Bay, or we have the detention centers for refugees or asylum seekers, and it's like so we to most of the world, the sort of society you have in Western Europe or North America is utopian, but actually it's really not, in terms of like most people have an okay standard of living, but we shove all our problem people into a box somewhere, like a conceptual box somewhere, and then we don't have to think about it. Lovely stuff, So it's like here, these are all the troublemakers, the problem makers that don't quite fit in with society at whole, or a bit too deviant to just have them floating around. All right, just bung them up on the moon.
Move on to the final bit within the future politics theme, and that is the Sirius 4 getting Dominion status, which is akin to other British Empire colonies in a post-Suez world. The example I'm bringing up is British Honduras, which became a self-governing colony in 1964 and renamed itself Belize in 1973, and excused the general's loaded 1973 language of tin pot colony. Decolonisation basically being reutilised in a space science fiction term there.
Well, I suppose as well, it gives an idea that perhaps Earth is a bit on the wane as a power, doesn't it? It can't even exercise power over its colonies anymore. Now it's given Dominion status, very much in a terminology that British people at the time would understand. I think it shows that perhaps it's meant to show that Earth is very much an analogue for Britain in the present day, so the future Earth. It's a waning imperial power, isn't it? That's what it suggests to me.
If I remember rightly, we get to see that kind of self-governing colony in Malcolm Hulke's previous iterations, the Pertwee era, literally entitled Colony in Space.
And I suppose if you think to perhaps the time, how people might have thought back then, sort of like the fact that now a sort of Asian equivalent power, the Draconians, we were talking about how they were sort of depicted as being Japanese, which as opposed to European. The fact that now Earth, or the UK, has fallen to a point that it's now competing with a country from an Asian country would be considered a bit. People perhaps then back then would look at that not ideal, a bit of a fall from grace, a sign of decline. So perhaps there's a bit of thinking there. Obviously, at the time, Japan was having its economic recovery from the Second World War and was pretty much outcompeting the West economically, apart from maybe the US, to the point, wasn't it, by the 1980s, everyone was thinking that Japan is going to be the future of the world, and that's why there's a lot of sci-fi that depicts Japan, not China, as being the dominant superpower.
Although, of course, in that example, Japan was given that opportunity to have a post-economic recovery, having been whacked into the ground for trying to be an empire by a different empire who lobbed couple of nuclear bombs at them.
One thing that stood out to me is that when the Master comes to the President of Earth and General Williams, and he gets told, "I'm not giving away these prisoners to a tin pot colony," the President of Earth is like, they're a devolved power and legally we have given them these rights. It's weirdly portrayed like he's getting through on like a technicality. It's not portrayed like the people of Sirius 4 are being respected. The people of Sirius 4 have been graciously given this, and they're having to fight for their right in order to keep it against people who absolutely hate them, who still think of them in the previous way, like, you're just some colony out there. Well, no, we're not a colony. We are a devolved power, and we will be treated as such. And so I imagine, I barely even have to imagine, that the people who had declared themselves independent were having to fight to all hell in order to keep that and be respected by the British Empire and by other countries around the world. You can't just leave an empire after loads of time and expect everything to go your way. The people around the world would definitely have to be fighting all the time. Wales and Scotland are always having to fight the English. I mean, if we look at Scotland relatively recently, their independence vote was struck down. They can't have a referendum on independence because it's not considered their territory, basically. It's like, this would affect the Union too much, so you can't have it. They're still having to fight to have more and more rights. They can't leave on their own ground.
Yeah, I suppose it's quite easy to see it as Malcolm Hulke having a bit of a parody, or having a bit of a jab at the British establishment. You could almost imagine if you repainted this scene into something looking out of Yes Minister, where it's some dignitary from a former African colony or something like that coming. You could almost imagine a similar power dynamic, and well, yes, I know, but yes, Minister, but we've now devolved power to them, so on a technicality we have to entertain these people. I could just imagine something like that. So it's a good little political satire there, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if they happen to be quite good at football as well, so be it. Bringing it right up to the present day at time of recording. Anyway, as we briefly mentioned about the Draconians and the humans, we'll move on to the other theme that we've noted in Frontier in Space. That of xenophobia, or to quote Terry Nations, the Daleks, the dislike for the unlike. As we've mentioned a few times already, the Draconians are seen as the eastern power block, so to speak, whilst the humans of Earth are seen as the western power block. Indeed, it's Barry Letts' concern of the Cold War that brings up this whole Frontier in Space story arc. And indeed, we've got espionage plots and counterplots, well, at least in the first 3 episodes of this story anyway.
The way I see this story is a fairly simple morality tale. The Master is quite literally making it so people are seeing what they want to see because they're blinded by fear, and that's bad. The xenophobia in this is baked into the systems that we see. We see people right down to people transporting flour, that they're gonna see things that they don't like as draconians, and when they're hypnotized as such. It is a fairly simple morality tale about you can't see what's really there because you're xenophobic. At least that's how I read
Yeah.
the metaphor of the hypnosis ray.
Down to the unflattering nicknames akin to racial epithets against the Draconians.
Yeah, I didn't get that.
The hypnotic sound. The hypnotic sound didn't make the humans say that. That was already within their societal structure and tone, because obviously the historical outlay of there's been a previous war between the humans and Draconia exists within this story.
What's interesting is the only time it's really commented on is the Doctor very early on. I think goes to Joe, tells Joe, and it's like, yeah, this is basically a racist term. To paraphrase.
Yeah, I'm not proud of that. Moving on. It's very
it's like, but the characters carry on saying it throughout the story as well. Not the Doctor, but the human characters, and it just sort of is a bit unremarked upon. You're just like, oh, okay. It's a good way of illustrating how it's that sort of racism where what is it? If you watch an old program or anything that sort of accurately tries to depict maybe 100, 150 years ago, and people will just use all sorts of racial terms, not with any hatred behind them, but just like, oh, that person from said background is this racial slur, and it's like there's no hatred behind that. That's just how it is. That's the racism in that society was so baked in, and here this racist animus towards the Draconians is so baked in. It's not a big deal to just call them by racial slurs.
I think to an extent it's also reflective of the audience, and I'm going to expand upon what I mean by that. The Doctor says it's a rather unflattering nickname. Nowadays we'd flat out just say it's a horrible racist slur. Don't say it. This is a children's show, so I'm not expecting the Doctor to say, well, these people have a thing which in your time would be similar called the D word. And then we're all supposed to go, oh, actually, that's kind of disgusting. Like, in a children's show, we have a racist slur being bandied about. The Doctor says it's wrong, but it's never, as you say, Nick, properly commented on. Racism,
or challenged. Yeah,
exactly. Racism nowadays, we only have to look at the changing perception of the towns of Wen Chiang to know how big of an issue in today's society racism is. Like, even just like alleging someone is a racist is a massive deal. Like, racism is like our big taboo of the moment.
It's one of the worst things you could accuse anyone of, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Nowadays.
But in this one, using racist slurs is like, well, of course they would be. It's an unflattering nickname. It's like, to an extent, even children would see that racist slurs would be used. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of bad. Like, that's very reflective of audience views. Like, well, racist slurs are just a fact of life. Not to bring up a certain author too much, named J.K. Rowling, but she includes like a magic phobic slur in her stories. Like, muggles is essentially used as an infantilizing slur in her children's books. I mean, I know as time's gone on, we've sort of taken a back seat and looked at J.K. Rowling and sort of gone, oh no, what the hell were we doing? Well, at least some people have. But it's interesting how baked in racism is in our society, as well as the fictional society. Racial slurs are just a thing.
But as of how 50 years ago we've moved on is Doctor Who now. So the Doctor in Frontier in Space, he just sort of remarks upon it, explains the term, and then moves on, and never really pulls up any character who says it in front of him. And it is said in front of him again. Whilst you move on to the 12th Doctor era, when you've got he's got companion Bill Potts, and it is Thin Ice, that episode. The aristocrat in that essentially makes a racist remark about Bill, and the Doctor just punches him. That Doctor Who very much reflects our society, and it shows that although we're very conscious that racism is still baked in to a certain extent, there's now also this reaction against racism that's a lot more prevalent now than it was 50 years ago. So Malcolm Hulke was kind of going, well, yes, there is racism here and it is a bit bad, and he's showing that with the hypnosis device, but he's not really fully committing to that, is he? Because he's not really criticizing the characters for using racial slurs, whilst now you move up to sort of a more present day Doctor Who story where it's just like the Doctor just flat out punches racists.
And indeed, I want to move on to that point of conflict with people fearing the other, so attacking the other, causing war. We talk about the previous war between Earth and the Draconians, which was caused over an error of judgment over damaged ships. I'm thinking 10 years previous, 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis, and perhaps the Tonkin incident, which escalated the Vietnam War. Again, we're down to that East versus West. God knows what they're going to do. Oh, yes, they're going to put weapons of mass destruction here, or the domino effect means that the communist takeover of Vietnam is something that us as an empire have to put a stop to.
Yeah, and I think with Malcolm Hulke, he follows through with his whole trying to make it as grey morally as he can, because it's the humans' fault. It's General Williams' fault for that previous incident, because he's misinterpreted it. And he's essentially thought they're going to be like humans and be untrustworthy, but it's actually the Draconians have that code of honor and actually very trustworthy that they wouldn't actually attack. So even though the humans are the ones that we sort of more understand and are quite clearly analog for the Western Bloc in the Cold War, it's like they are actually the reason that this conflict could even possibly be started by the Master or riled up, because it's the humans' fault they caused that incident in the past.
What I also like about that is that General Williams wasn't thinking on the terms of his enemy. He was thinking, these people are going to do what I expect them to do, based largely on my preconceptions of them and what someone from Earth would do in that situation. He wasn't trying to go to their level in order to speak to them that way. And so that is an interesting bit of like how humans understand each other. We understand our own cultures, and when we don't understand opposing cultures, well, that's when we start to run into difficulties.
It very much reminded me that we are watching what is ostensibly a children's show, or perhaps better described as a family show for all ages. So you would never have this moral about turn that General Williams has in real life.
But indeed, it's still a family show which in its 10th year of broadcasting is more than happy to tackle the subjects of xenophobia, a dislike for the unlike, as it did right at the beginning in 1963, whilst also talking about the politics of then and the potential future in which could happen for the human race, both in terms of society, economically, politically, and as well as technologically and scientifically. And that indeed translates into Doctor Who both 50 years ago and now. Thank you very much for listening. You can find us on Blogspot, which redirects to the audio version of this episode on iTunes. Leave positive comments there, it helps. If you've watched the slideshow version on YouTube, you can like, comment and subscribe. We're available on Facebook also. We shall be back next time with Planet of the Daleks. Until then, I've been Ben.
I've been Luke.
And I've been Nick.
Thank you, and goodbye.